Hello, everybody. It's James here, WSI. My next guest is a man that I've been trying to get on this show for 18 months solid. So much so that I was hounding the wrong Kevin Sullivan, who does TV production work for AEW. That's how keen I was to get this man on the show. But I'm so pleased he's here with us today. It's Kevin Sullivan. How are you?
I'm fine, James. I'm a big fan of your show. You've done a great job. You're really good at details.
Well, I'm hoping that you'll give us more details on some of your career. And the problem with somebody who's worked in the business as long as you have and been in so many prominent positions and companies and territories as you have, where do I start? So generally in interviews, I mean, I know where I'm going to start, but where do people generally start in interviews when they talk to you? Is it always WCW? Is it always Florida? What are the questions you get the most?
Yeah, it sort of goes to Florida, because of the connection with Dusty and Mulligan and Andre,
Well, I will be, I'm sorry, also starting at Florida, but not quite actually, because this is more newsworthy at the moment, and Ric Flair has just had his final match. I imagine that you saw bits and bobs of it, unless you saw the entire thing. What is your opinion of the match?
I love Ric Flair. I mean, they were trying to get rid of Ric Flair when Jim Herd was running roughshod over the booking committee back in '89. Okay, so 99, 2009, 2009, over 30 years. Ric Flair is Ric Flair. Obviously, people wanted to see it, right? Wasn't it the second largest grossing non-WWE or WCW or AEW pay-per-view?
Yeah, I think it was like the second largest independent pay-per-view after All Out. You know, the pre-AEW one.
The first one, yeah. And they drew, 8,000 people? Was that correct?
Yeah, I think around that.
And basically, they did it, and the guys on the card are all my friends. So a lot of them are my friends, so like Jay and Jeff and Fatu. So they did it with guys that didn't have a lot of current TV exposure, even though Lethal just got picked up. So in my head, they actually came out just for Rick. I'm glad it's over, but I'm afraid it's not the last one.
What do you think? Is it just going to be a money thing? Is it going to be an ego thing with Rick that he maybe tried just yet one more retirement match?
Yeah, and the reason why I say this, and I may be wrong, but it was a tag match.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Rick, he's very competitive. And he's going to say, well, if I got through the tag match, now I got to just do a little bit more training and get my wind up again, because there was parts of the match, I think, first time in my life I've ever seen Flair blow up. When he's laying on the mat, I see him wanting to have one final match in a single match and maybe beat Punky Morton, and Punky would be a great opponent, but I think we all held our breath. I certainly did. I didn't want anything bad to happen to Rick. And, I thought with all his health issues, take a slam or something like that, because doesn't he have a defibrillator?
Yeah, he's got a pacemaker, I think, yeah.
Just the jolt on that. Doesn't he take blood pressure pills too?
I hate to imagine what he takes on a daily basis, but yeah, he's not in the finest of fettle.
Yeah, I love that, finest of fettle. But I thought, hey, you got through with it. Enough is enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if he goes back, it's willing. You're putting yourself into diminishing returns.
I think that's fair enough. One more thing about Ric Flair that I've got to ask is, who Rick getting you in trouble when he kept referring to you on WCW Nitro or whatever as Devil? Was it WCW who didn't want him to say that? Was it Turner who didn't want him to say that? Or was it you who didn't want to be referred to as the Devil?
It was me. I was just, I never used that word when I was doing that gimmick. I never used satanic. When I used that word, it was a cultural difference. But Rick being Rick, he gets excited. So I said, hey, can you calm it down? I shouldn't even brought it up. It just reminded him of doing more.
We're going to go back to the beginning of the career. I'm going to be skipping over so much. As you can imagine, we're going to be spending a few hours doing these interviews, and there's still nowhere near enough time to cover everything. But one thing I always like to know from people who are powerlifters, bodybuilders, that kind of thing, was max lifts as far as bench press, squats, deadlifts. What were your maxes when you were at your absolute peak of strength?
I was never a great bench presser because I ruined my shoulder. I only did 405, but I could incline 415. But I deadlifted 640, and I squatted 790.
Jesus.
Yeah.
What was your sort of involvement in powerlifting? Were you competition? Were you just gifted amateur? Did you go into some big competitions?
Yeah, I got into some competitions, but what happened was Tony Atlas and I were partners in Atlanta, and I had been powerlifting just for my own benefit. And Tony said, hey, why don't you enter a bodybuilding contest? I said, no. So Tony said, I bet you $100 or something. Bought me a pair of posing tights, and in 8 weeks I went from like 240 to 198. I entered 4 contests and did well. Then Doug Furness, do you remember the name?
Is this the original one in the 70s, not the
the K&M Connection, was it? Doug Furness.
Yeah.
He was out of Tennessee. He played for the University of Tennessee.
Oh, yes.
Fullback.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, I'm sorry.
He had huge thighs. I broke him in the business, and I used to start training with him, and he got me involved in powerlifting. Doug was a premier athlete, and I went to some contests with him. Yeah.
So did you start all the proper powerlifting after you got into wrestling? Because you thought, obviously, it benefits my physique to look good on TV.
Yeah, and the bodybuilding too. I did it when I got into wrestling.
Right then, we are going to move off the bodybuilding, and we're going to start, I'm sad to say, straight into Florida, in a sense that we're skipping quite a few years and, how you got into the business and everything else, but we're going to go straight into Florida. And as you know, and as apparently you watched as well, I used to do a weekly show with Don Morocco, and I've heard a number of stories about King Curtis and Mark Lewin. And the way that Don always talks about Mark Lewin and King Curtis as a duo is that they were always trying to steal territories or mess people out and they were never successful. But I mean, is that something you can speak to?
Yeah. First of all, Mark actually, Mark was probably at one time Vince McMahon Sr.'s favorite babyface of all times. And Mark got into some kind of trying to steal it. When do you remember the story about Argentina Rocca running against? Argentina Rocca was a huge star for Vince. And then when his time was done, that was when Vince was bringing Bruno up. Jim Crockett Sr. went in against Vince in Sunnyside Gardens, and they tried to steal or take away the territory. So, I mean, and I think that dispute was over a town because, the Crockett's and McMahon territories bumped into one another because Baltimore was right. Who knows whose place it actually was in. It was in, if you look at it in realistic terms, it was in nobody's place. It's supposed to be freedom of, business. But so Mark tried to do it there. One of his dearest friends, the Sheik, he tried to do it there. I think he tried to actually do it in Calgary too, and he tried to do it in Vancouver. But he did end up going to Australia, and him and Curtis were hugely successful. And then when Jim sold to Tony Kalani, Barnett sold to Tony Kalani, they went to Australia and took Australia and were hugely successful. Made all kinds of money. Not Australia, I'm sorry. Jim sold Australia to Tony, and they went to New Zealand. And besides New Zealand, they were running Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Samoa. So, yeah. Everybody loved working for those guys. You know, it was Party Central.
With Mark, just briefly, I've started asking people, and I'm probably going to do a compilation of who does the best Jim Barnett impression. What is your best Jim Barnett impression apart from "Oh My Boy"?
Yeah, well, we used to do for a while. I don't know if Don brought this up. We used to do for a while in Atlanta our interviews on Tuesdays at a studio, and Monday was Augusta, which was a big town for Georgia Championship Wrestling. And I was always in a pretty good slot there. And Barnett would come to he wouldn't come to the towns except if it was the Armory, but he would come to the interviews. So I picked up on something. One time I had gotten blood, and Jim said, "Oh, Kevin, my boy." But one time after I saw that, I'd go in there, and on Mondays I usually bleed, and I would take a pencil and just draw it, put mercurochrome in it, and draw it again, and made it look like I had a zipper in my head. And I'd walk in, and he'd go, "Kevin, my boy, you've done it again. You've ruined your face. But I'll make sure there's a bonus. You may have to go to a plastic surgeon." I do. Oh, he was, and the thing about him, James, of all the people in the wrestling business, he was one of the smartest of all times. He started studio wrestling. He was politically savvy enough to get away with, back in the 50s, being an NWA member and running against NWA members. You know, he was politically tied. If you look at Jimmy Carter's inauguration, Jim was on the third row. I mean, he always put money into politics. That's why Australia was so successful. He backed the Conservative Party there. No, the Labour Party there. Mm-hmm. And Jim was just a very, very smart guy, but he could pick talent before you knew the guy was going to be good. He was very, very smart.
Just because it was such a great opening, pardon pun, to bring up Jim Barnett, I couldn't let it go. But I want to come back to Mark Lewin, and somebody mentioned this. I threw out that you were coming on to the show, and some of the subscribers have submitted questions as well. And somebody mentioned that The Undertaker was influenced by Mark Lewin's Purple Haze gimmick. Do you think that's true? Do you know it to be true?
I don't know it to be true, but I have a feeling it is, especially the eyes rolled. And of course, Mark has superseded anything. And I always say, when they talk about people drawing money, James, do you think anybody's ever drawn as much money for as longest time as The Undertaker?
That's
30 years.
This is a great question. I don't have any names to throw back at you. I mean, maybe Jim Londos or someone, I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't think 30 years. Londos was huge in the 40s and maybe end of 30s and 40s. By the 50s, early 50s, he was pretty much done. Undertaker was, I mean, the streak, so many big things, and a very nice guy. Glad to see things happen to him.
Because with Mark Lewin, you can't say King Curtis, and Mark Lewin, you can't leave one out without the other. Yeah. When was the first time that you met King Curtis?
I met Mark when I was young in Florida, and then I ended up working with. He was the Maniac in Atlanta, and I ended up working with him and Abdullah, me and Tony Atlas, and then eventually me and Abdullah teamed against Mark, and I believe it was the Great Mephisto. Mm-hmm. So I knew Mark for a long time, but when I met Curtis the first time he came to Florida, I've come to see the Milky Way. Oh, walk down the Milky Way one last time. This guy he was something special. I mean, from what I can gather, Superstar, Dusty, all stole from Curtis. Curtis was an orator. That's what he went to school for. And great guy, everybody's friend. I mean, you heard the story about his head, what it looked like, and what it was used for at different occasions. But him and Mark they were the good cop, bad cop. Mark was the bad cop. Curtis was the good cop. Oh, brother, I'll calm him down. Don't worry. I'll get you the money. Yeah.
Don, when I was doing the podcast with him, he mentioned this a few times, that he said that as far as Curtis's style goes, he predated Bruiser Brody, he predated Stan Hansen, he predated Abdullah the Butcher. He was like the original wild man who would fight out into the crowds, and you could speak, sort of confirm that Don is right there, and sort of he was the baseline of which all other, monster brawlers are built upon.
Absolutely, because I was good friends with Frank, and Frank even told me that when he first tripped to Japan, Curtis told him, "This is what you do," and he took up, the mantle of Curtis. But Curtis was the first, and Brody was so good not to try to do the interviews exactly like Curtis, because nobody could, But here you have this wild man going through the audience, bleeding, like a stuffed pig, and then talking about walking in the streets of Calcutta to go to the burning sands. It was like, whoa, this guy's too much. But I mean, everybody. When we would do promos, I mean, I would get a kick out of like when we were in Florida, and Curtis would step up to the mic to do the promos after the TV tapings. Superstar was there, Dusty was there, Blackjack. Well, I think are three of the greatest promos of all time. They'd be looking at Curtis like they were little kids. I was too. I mean, it was amazing. Amazing. Great athlete, too. People don't realize that. I'm sure Don told you what a great surfer he was. Great surfer, played pro football, came from a well-established political family. Do you know that I think his three great-grandfathers was the last, head of the military before the United States impounded Hawaii.
No.
So they've been there for a long time. Yeah, great.
Now, I've heard this from Dom. I've heard this from Jerry Briscoe. Did you ever partake in the Cosmic Cookie?
I just got here with Chris, as you know, and we were talking about it last night. He took us all to Diamond Head, and we all got out. It was Fonzie, it was Kurt Hennig, it was Hart, me, and we all lined up like little ducks with our tongues out. We were on, like I said, we were on top of Diamond Head, and Curtis hit everybody. And I'm looking at these guys, and 15 minutes later, they're, like out of a bad movie. I'm saying, they're full of shit. They're ribbing me. I looked at Mark and said, that didn't work. You guys ribbed me. And he looked at me like this, and I stuck out my tongue again. And Curtis Curtis was going to hit me. Mark said, "Oh, really?" And as soon as Curtis hit me, the other thing went up my spine. I'm looking over the top of Diamond Head, and it's going up and down like an accordion. Didn't affect Curtis at all. I went out that night, like at midnight, and swam as far as I could in the ocean. And when the sun came up, I thought I was swimming in the light and was being attracted by a beam. And Curtis would do this every night. And when he went to Australia and New Zealand, he'd do it on the plane. I mean, there's a famous story about, two famous stories. Not Skull Murphy, Brute Bernard. He hit Brute Bernard with it in Melbourne. And the police arrest him because he thought he was a pig outside. And then Jimmy Golden, from the Welsh family, Jim Barnett brought Jimmy over because Jimmy was a young, handsome young man. He was there 2 days. Curtis hit him when he was wandering the streets for another 2 days. He got on a plane and went home.
Did you ever hear the story? I mean, I'll probably fill this in and then we'll move on. But Don told me that the reason why Curtis's WWF run only lasted a couple of months was because they had to go over the border to Canada. And it was either go over the border to Canada or for Curtis it was stay home because he had a shipment of 250 tabs of acid coming in that day. And it was either or, and he went home and chose the acid.
I believe that. I mean, yeah, Curtis. Curtis lived in a house the government gave him because he was at least 50% Hawaiian. Are you familiar with that?
No.
In Hawaii, if you can show that you're 50% or over, they give you housing. And beautiful house. And Curtis, that's how far back their family goes. In fact, at one time, there were 4 Curtis Ayakea on the island that were, it was Curtis's father, Curtis's son, Rocky, and Rocky's son. So, I mean, they've been there forever. I get a kick of, the Polynesian wrestling. The guys that came from there, they all could work, and every one of them looked up to Curtis. Every one of them. Anything. You go down the beach, and Curtis would be doing his preaching, and everybody would be just staring at him. And he was, and James, if people can, look Curtis up when he was in New York, his first run there. Not when he came back and won the tag belts with Baron, but when he was a little bit younger and in great shape. He used to do this dive off the top rope with a chop. Man, he was good.
That's a bit of homework for everyone to do as well. See if you can find some footage. We're going to move on. I'm going to ask a couple of probably fairly random questions relating to Florida. But one thing that I wrote quite late, but I thought was actually a good thing to ask you, and is, of all the booking proteges of Eddie Graham, so including you, Dusty, Dutch Mantell, Bill Watts, there's probably more that I've not thought of. Who do you think stayed most true to Eddie's vision of what pro wrestling should be as far as booking goes?
That's a great question. No one's ever handed me that one.
It's a bit tough as well because I know you're throwing you into it.
Maybe Watts, because I think Dusty was so good, but Dusty saw the future. He saw the entertainment coming, where Eddie wanted to clamp down on that. His thing was, you got to make it as close to an athletic contest or they're not going to come. Watts could do that more than Dusty could, or me and the other guys that you mentioned, because Watts was isolated. He's in the deep South. People aren't, in Florida, it's a cosmopolitan state. it's not a southern state. It's a northern state. It just happens to be down south. Dusty would venture into entertainment more than Watts would. Eddie's thing was wrestling first. I mean, Florida was built of blood and guts and wrestling, but the wrestling usually was on the undercard, and then there was Eddie. And then when Eddie was smart enough, think about this, James. All those wrestlers that became promoters all stayed their welcome way too long. Eddie retired very young and gave the young guys a shot because he knew that people would know that he was the owner and that it would expose the business. Where Gagne, I mean, the Bruiser, who I thought was a wonderful guy, but I mean, you can't be keeping the young guys down. But going back to what I'm at, the reason why Bill could do that, the Mississippi and Louisiana was so isolated that he could keep it wrestling.
With Bill, I mean, I'm thinking off the top of my head is that I believe Bill put himself in quite a lot of main events as well. He was obviously the owner, he was the commentator, but then all of a sudden someone slaps him or punks him out, and then all of a sudden Bill's back in the main event again to draw.
Right. But the thing about that was they all did that. Like, I'll give you a funny example. One time, me and Mike were wrestling the Samoans in a program, and we were supposed to drop the belts to them. And that was in the Bayfront Center, which was, I don't know if you know it, that the Saturday night town was the big town, but it was 4 of them and they rotated. And St. Pete had been the town for years. And Mike and I went dirtbag riding, and Mike on Saturday, and the show was on Sunday. And Mike flipped the bike and ripped his hamstring and couldn't wrestle. Eddie came in to wrestle the Samoans. Eddie did the job because I asked him why. And he said, well, people know I haven't wrestled in a year. I'm going to go out and y'all going to lose. Well, I'm not going to wrestle again for another year. So Eddie had that foresight to do that. You know, again, Bill would do it because people don't think about this. They say, why does a promoter do that? Because you got Mark, Lewin, and Curtis lurking in the background. You get a guy too hot, he's going to run into a TV production guy or a program director or somebody saying, oh, have you ever thought about running your own company? You know, so it was because that was done quite frequently right before my time. And when I first got in the business, it was done. I remember about 6 big invasions or breakaways.
I am going to ask you a couple more with Florida, and dare I say, I'm going to have to skip WWF and Georgia. But a couple of people, in fact, I think 3 separate people asked me to ask you very specifically, Army of Darkness, but Luna Vachon. They all want to know about how Luna Vachon was, and did you bring her into the business? How did you two sort of meet up?
I didn't bring her in the business. She was a sweetheart. I just found out about this a month ago from Gangrel. Do you know when the Vachons had their own wrestling company in Montreal?
No, I don't.
It was the Vachons and Edward Carpentier and Andre. There was 2 wrestling companies, the Rougeaus and the guys I just mentioned. That was the hottest place in North America, Montreal. And she was the stepdaughter of Paul Vachon, and her mother and father I don't know exactly what happened to them, but they died in some accident. And they left Luna the money, and Luna put the money up to back the Vachons. But when she came to Florida, that was the deal where she was supposed to give the Wrestler of the Year award, and she was a little cute little thing. And I popped her, I came back. And I told her I had her, and I came back and I said, I'm sorry. She said, that's all you got, pussy? I'm a Vashon. And everybody laughed. She was a great, great girl.
With the Army of Darkness in general, how much autonomy did you have as far as what you said, who you brought in, your suggestions being taken?
At that time, Dusty was the booker. He allowed me to say and do whatever I wanted. Bringing guys in, I suggested Roop. They brought him in. Dusty was Dusty was a huge star. He's going all over. One of the towns he's going to quite frequently was Houston. And Mark lived in Houston at the time and only worked for Paul in Houston. And he brought Mark in. And Dusty was real easy for me to work with.
Is there anybody who you wish you could have got your hands on to bring into the Army of Darkness that just never quite made it down, or for one reason or another, it just didn't work out?
Yeah, I would have loved to have the Missing Link.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, he was very, very good, ahead of his time. He drew money in WWF at the time, right?
I think he was around there about 85 or something. He had a very short stint in the WWF.
Yeah, because he wanted to go back to Canada, I guess. He was getting sick at the time.
Yeah, that would have been the absolute perfect one. And is it Metal Health, Bang Your Head, that he had the song?
Yeah.
I'm actually going to look through the script and see what I'm going to ask you next, because I hate to say I'm going to skip through the WWF, but I probably will ask this. Georgia, was Tommy Rich more loved, or was the Fabulous Freebirds more hated?
I think it was about, I have to say, I was going to say it was about equal, but no. Tommy, we were talking about that. Chris and I were talking about that last night. I flew into Columbus, Ohio last night, and I was on the first show that Georgia Championship Wrestling went to Columbus, Ohio. And I was on the first match that night against Steve Kern. And Tommy was on either the main event or semifinal leading up to the main event. And it was like Elvis Presley was in the building. Girls were throwing their panties. They were throwing their room keys. I had never seen anything like it. And when you work with Tommy, all you had to do was knock him down and let him sell. People were screaming. But on the other hand, the Freebirds were fabulous. They were fabulous. A little tongue in cheek, but fabulous Freebirds, but they were. And they brought, they were the first ones I ever saw have music. The Freebird rule. They were very innovative guys and worked very hard. And each one of them was very different, but they blended as great as a team.
Well, one more thing with Georgia is, now I've almost, without quite knowing it, almost got a compilation of people who were giving their opinions of Ole Anderson, and I found one person who liked him, and it was Dr. Tom Pritchard. And even Don said, man, out of him and Matt Bourne, they're the only two people I never got on with in wrestling. And but you worked under Ole, you worked with Ole as a boss, as a booker, as a wrestler. What do you think of Ole?
I understand why Tom would like him. Tom has a very abstract sense of humor. Ole was a cranky bastard, but he did have a handle on, I believe, how to book, but he let personal shit get into his way. If he didn't like anybody, for some reason, he wouldn't use them the right way. And if he liked somebody, he would overdo it. But he could be a miserable bastard. I mean, miserable bastard. I remember one time there was a rumor that he picked up that I was going to take his job in Georgia. So I was over there pretty well. You know, they put me with Tony Atlas. I was national TV champion, all that. And he comes up with this idea that he says to me, I'm going to put you in a tag match against me and Hanson, you know, and he's going to give me these young kids as my partners. He said, we're going to beat your partners until you bring in a partner. I said, how long is this going to go on? He said, 6 weeks. I said, okay, I'm gone. I got back to my house, and Jerry Briscoe called me, and Jim got on the phone, and he said, Kevin, my boy, you got to come back. I said, Jim, I'm no idiot. What do you think? He said, what's his plan? When I told him the plan, he was silent on the phone. He said, well, I'll rectify that. Just come back. But I mean, I saw Ole get knocked out by Black Rick Mulligan 3 different times. You know, I mean, he would aggravate Mulligan. I mean, if you get knocked out by a guy who's had hands like catcher's mitts, why are you going to aggravate him? Ole was a little goofy, yeah.
Who did Ole like? Or at least who did he like as far as...
He loved Stan Hansen. He loved Stan Hansen. He loved Buzz Sawyer. Everybody else sucked. You know what I mean? Everybody sucked, except Ole and Gene. You know, I heard him say, was it that one time he said, I made Ric Flair the world heavyweight champion just to get him out of my territory. Well, he didn't make Ric champion. There was, at the time, a committee, right? And I don't even think Ole had a vote for that. So, I mean, he had... but as a worker, the Andersons, back in that day and back in that time and back in that work rate, were as fine a team as there were.
With Ole, for me as a younger fan, the thing I associate with Ole is that specific font that he would make T-shirts out of. It was just that late 70s font that every T-shirt had, but he always seemed to have a different one every week.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you now a bit of a game, and it's something I've only done once before, and we're going to call it just best and worst. It's pretty easy. I'm going to give you a question. It's going to be the answer's going to be tell me the best of the question and the worst of the question. And the first one is the best and worst giants of wrestling other than Andre.
Blackjack Mulligan, one of the best. I mean, it's funny that people don't consider him as big as he was. He was 6'7", 6'8". And like I mentioned earlier, James, he had hands like catcher's mitts. And tough guy. And he actually was the one that made me in Florida, because the first time I worked with him, they stretched him out. So, and the worst, the McGuire twins.
Did you? Now I've heard this before. I can't remember who said it, but someone said it's a singular horror show when you have to see those two in the shower after the match.
It looked like melting sundays. Oh, you know, and they married. I think they married the girls. I believe were twins. You know what I mean? And they had special harnesses, and oh God.
What?
That was a real.
Special harnesses
to join together as man and wife.
My God, where did you go to make those?
I have no. Well, they were in San Francisco at the time, so I'm sure there was a shop at every corner.
Some sort of like ribbons of some sort of swing sort. Maybe it's one of those hammocks where they lower you, like disable people into the pool.
Yeah, I love it.
Now, since I mentioned Andre the Giant, I always love to get everybody's opinion and stories of Andre the Giant. And the usual question I ask is the first time you met him and how just taken aback were you when you saw him for the first time?
I was so taken back. Like, you wouldn't see this cup in his hand. But I became very good friends with Andre. I used to get Andre girls. Mm. And he was such a wonderful guy. He did the nicest thing I think a guy could ever do. I I have a picture at home, one of the few wrestling memorabilia pictures I have of my brother sitting in his left hand, me sitting in his right hand, and him holding us like we're two babies. My brother and I took Andre to an Italian restaurant in East Boston, which is the Italian section of Boston. And my brother was just gawking at him the whole time. And we started talking about my nephews. My brother lived 90 miles outside of Boston, New Hampshire. And he was saying, I don't know what the boys are going to do. They got show and tell tomorrow. I don't know what they're going to do. Andre said, I'll go. Andre had a day off. We went up and show and tell. Those kids were over for 20 years in that town. Yeah. And he was, James, I'm sure everybody tells you how big he was. But when you couldn't see the beer in his hand, or you put your hand and it disappeared. And when I met him, he wasn't in pain. So he was much more mellow. And then as the years went by, the pain and the body breaking down, I felt very bad for him because he was a very nice man.
And of course, the other question that I'm sure everybody asks, but the most he ever drank in one sitting, that you were present for, at least.
Well, I was talking to Bill Alfonso last night. Alfonso was one of the rarest referees of all times before he became the manager. So, like I said, Andre and I were friends, and I was going to wrestle Andre in Orlando on a Sunday night. So I used to get Andre a bottle of Crown Royal. So Billy came over. He said, this is what we're going to do. This is what Andre wants to do. I said, okay, whatever he wants. So I said, Billy, take this back to the boss. He said, are you sure? I said, yeah, take it back. So he goes back, and halfway through the show, Billy comes back in the dressing room intermission. I said, why did you question me? You know I was going to. He said, yeah, but he had two on the way here. I said, what? Man, he came out of there, and the deal used to be I would go first, and then he would come down, and I'd jump on him and rat-tat-tat, and then he'd post me and then knock me, and I'd go on my knees. He'd step over the ropes, and we'd go home. Came down, he had a buzz on, and he threw a chair, a metal chair, like a discus. And before he was doing it, he's fooling around with me, making me he's going to throw it there. I was dancing around like this. And when he threw it, I ducked. I was in the ring, and it went right over me because I ducked and hit the metal, post, the top of it, and went up in the air. And somebody got it and had him sign it later. But, wow, he was a specimen.
I know Mike Graham told this story once quite a few years ago. He said, and obviously everyone knows how strong, or has an idea of how strong Andre was. He said, or he claimed at the time he was like 220 pounds, and it was a battle royal. And Andre picked him up by one leg with one arm and just dumped and just let him go, just over the top rope with one arm. Did you ever feel like the strength of Andre in that sense?
Oh, like his hands, as I said, he had fingers like a Polish sausage. And during the matches when I worked with him, I worked a lot with him, and I didn't realize how many times I did work with him until I looked at a rundown of the years in Florida. Him and Dusty against me and Buzz was pretty common for a while. But when me and Buzz would be working, we both would jump him, push him in the corner, and he'd flip me, and then he'd flip Buzz, and then I'd come back. And one night he put his hands in my face. It was like my head disappeared. He shoved me, and I couldn't have stopped if I had a harness on me. It was hooked to him. I went ass over tea kettle, went out of the ring. He was so strong, I always thought, could you imagine if he had trained a little, hit the weights a little? Could have been incredible.
Could have been incredible. Every single time I now hear the word harness, I'm now going to think of the Maguire twins.
Oh,
I will. Well, I'll tell you what. Then we'll go on to the second one. I've got about 13 or 14 more here. So, the greatest and worst tag teams ever.
Midnight Express, Rock and Roll Express.
Jet Set.
Oh, by far. Daddy said so. Daddy said so. Yeah, by far. That's the topper. That's it.
This is a bit of a weird one, actually. I'm not sure there is a worse, but the greatest wrestling midget, and was there a terrible one? I don't know. You tell me.
Lord Littlebrook, Little Beaver, Fuzzy Cupid were the great ones. There was a French-Canadian guy. I think it was Little Frenchie. He came down to wrestle. And we used to wrestle at Wednesday mornings in Florida, do the taping, and he was supposed to have a midget match. And Curtis gave him a cup of coffee. And about 30 minutes later, the guy's got his head in a bucket. And that was it for Little Frenchie. That was it. Most of the midgets are little people who could really work.
Next one is the best and worst foreign country you wrestled in.
I like England. I like the people there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even though you still haven't let my homeland go, even Paul McCartney said, "Give Ireland back to the Irish." I think the worst place was Nigeria.
Oh, is that Poweruti territory?
No, that he has that, but I did go for a guy called the Prophet. Barbarian set the tour up. He was a faith healer, and it was a funny thing. It was a cult. He had this thing called the Holy Temple of the Sacrament or something, but he had a inside arena that held 15,000 people. Everything was marble from the floor to the ceiling to the walls. And he had another 15,000 outside the amphitheater. And the thing started on Friday and ran till Monday morning, Friday night to Monday morning. And everybody that was there was a white young girl. And they all looked alike. They had the ponytails pulled tight. And I'm watching them. And, he would come and heal the people and drive the demons out. And I'm watching them. I'm going by a room, and I see them put the Alka-Seltzer in the girl's mouth and teach her how to do it. And I went in and I said, "Gotcha, I used to do that 30 years ago." But it was horrible. We were taken everywhere in a van with military with AK-47s. And I used to think, what if they hit a bump and pull the trigger? You know what I mean? It was horrible, horrible, horrible.
Good payday at least, though.
Yeah, but I mean, and I wanted to go to Africa, but I mean, you couldn't even go out. They wouldn't even let us go out. We were locked down there.
I honestly thought you were going to tell me it was a terrible payday.
No, it was good.
Oh.
It was good. Yeah.
Next one, the most underrated and most overrated main event star.
Well, if it was just wrestling, not main events, Brad Armstrong. Brad Armstrong should have been one of the biggest stars in the business. He was so smooth. But I think that was part of the problem too, was he was so smooth. And if the Brad Armstrong in the locker room could have come out on his interviews, he would have been a huge star. Main event. Ox Baker.
Really? See, I hear loads of great things about Ox Baker as a personality.
Oh, as a personality and as a person, and as the first time in, he's going to draw your money. But, you know, 2 left feet, he trip over you. He trip over himself. Nicest guy, great personality, had that great voice, the hard punch, and a lot of stuff going for him. But he was not aggressive enough, even though when he worked, he tried to be aggressive, but that's something, if you're a heel, you either have it or don't. One of the greatest, I tell guys when I talk to them that want to be heels, if you want to see a heel, watch Paul Orndorff. He had a different gear. James, you remember when he'd get a guy in the corner, start kicking him?
Mm-hmm.
And he'd go from first gear to second gear, and he end up in 6th gear. He was an amazing, amazing heel. I used to love to watch him perform.
The best and worst gimmick.
The best gimmick, Undertaker. The worst gimmick was me and Nash as Oz and the Great Wizard.
I may be asking about that in a little bit, but I'll move on for now, so keep that in your mind. The best and worst booker/writer.
Well, as a booker, I'd say back in the day, Eddie Graham, but the most creative guy was Dusty and Terry Funk. The worst booker, believe it or not, Roy Shires at the end. Roy Shires. He blew, San Francisco Open with Ray Stevens at the end. He was a complete moron.
Next one is best and worst commentator.
Good, solely the best. I mean, Jim Ross is close behind, but, we all tend to go back to where we were, But Gordon, a very interesting story. Gordon was found at a racetrack in Florida when Mike was just a small kid. He said, "Dad, I like it," because Eddie owned that racetrack. He said, "Dad, I love that guy's voice." And Eddie came to Gordon, and all his instructions this is a sport, treated like it. And Gordon never wavered. There was never any tongue-in-cheek bullshit. Gordon protected the business. He respected the business. To me, he was the best, but Jim Ross is very close. And the worst.
Well, before we go off Gordon solely, I'll sort of share something that I much later on saw that I used to love, and I think this was in Florida, where it was Gordon solely at a desk with just one microphone, and then the wrestler he would interview would sit down next to him, whether it was Boris Malenko or whoever it may be, and it seemed so less forced, even though they'd be like full of personality, the person they were interviewing. It seems so less forced and so much more real and so much more warm and inviting, and you can really sort of put your teeth into it.
James, I said to you before we went on the air about how you do your research. You're the first person that ever told me that, and that was my favorite interviews with him because it was one-on-one, and I got to dick with Gordon too. Like he was the uprighteous person, and I'd look at him, and MVP told me this story that when he was a kid, he knew Gordon was evil. And I said, why? He said, because when you looked at Gordon's ring, he had a Mason ring on. And you said, oh, I see you're a wise man from the East. And I would go down and I'd say, Gordon would say, let's stay on you, Mr. Sullivan. And I could transgress and say, oh, by the way, I was just a month ago at Princess Ananda, said to say hello. I don't know what you're talking about. And he would fall for it perfectly. And what you were talking about, the other thing was I watched him do it with Funk and Briscoe Briscoe and Dickie Murdoch. I watched him do it with Don. He made that event real. Because I remember Dickie Murdoch saying, the reason why I'm going to be Jack Briscoe is my fireman's carry is the best in the world and he can't block it and I'll be able to pin him. And I thought, pro wrestling, you talk about fireman's carry? And Gordon came back with some quip. I mean, yeah, I love that segment that they did. Great.
And it would always end as we're going to be at this arena this day. There's plenty of parking adjacent. It's 555, whatever the number is. We hope to see you there. So no matter what said it was just like, and then you hit the pitch at the end. It was great.
Yeah, he was very, very good.
And the worst commentator?
The Savolis, I love them, but Tommy Savoli looked like Jerry Lewis, exactly like him. And he talked like him. And, you know, he'd be stuttering. Yeah, you got it. He'd be stuttering. And you're doing a hot angle, and then the spit would be flying out of his mouth. But it was cheaper for them rather than getting an announcer.
Well, that's why Judo Gene LaBelle was doing the announcing. He had 10% of the of the office. They needed him to do something. Best and worst. Do you know what? I was going to ask one. That'll come down later. Best and worst road agents.
Best were Paul Orndorff and Arn Anderson. Ole was, even though he was a smart guy, when he became a road agent, he didn't give a shit, and he would just fluff it off.
Best and worst ring announcer.
You won't know this guy, I don't think. The Ali Liston fight in Miami when Ali won, it was Cassius Clay. The ring announcer was Frank Friedman. Sharp as a tack. Little Jewish guy, perfect tie, perfect suit, greased back hair, would smoke a cigarette like that, you know what I mean? Just out of a Hemingway movie, or not a Hemingway, but a movie in the 50s. He was super. And he would announce and get the people going. He was probably the best, and I had the pleasure of him. He was not only the boxing announcer, he was the wrestling announcer. And back then, Angelo Dundee's brother, Chris Dundee, ran Miami. So there'd be a lot of fighters in the audience, and he introduced them and made it really like a sport. The worst ring announcer, let me see. Coach John Heath, who was a wonderful guy, would ring announce sometimes. And John, I don't know if he had bad eyes or something, but invariably get the guys' names wrong or crossed up.
Do you know when you said a boxing guy, I thought you were going to say Jimmy Lennon Sr. then, but apparently not. I'll move on. Best and worst payoff man.
Nick Goulas was the worst payoff man, and I think Jim Barnett was the best. And even though I knocked Roy Shires, he was a great payoff man.
Best and worst town for audience reaction.
The Omni, when it was running steadily, you know, when it was part of the territory, was the best. The worst town was Jacksonville, Florida, believe it or
not. Why particularly that? Because AEW runs there all the time now. So
yeah, back in the day, well, if we ran it on a Saturday, it was a big building. If we ran it on a Saturday, we would draw a great crowd. When we ran it on a Thursday, it was in between paychecks, and we draw a third of the house that we would on Saturday, and it was so big that people were spread out. So when it's not condensed, the people will say, well, should I be yelling? Should I be screaming? Yeah.
And the very last one is best and worst storyline ever.
I think the Ric Flair Steamboat Funk. Rick went from the most hated wrestler. 20 seconds later, he was the biggest babyface. The worst, the ding dongs. The ding dongs.
Jim Herd questions
Yeah,
maybe incoming quite soon. Go on.
I'll give you another one. I'm in the booking committee. Jimmy Cornette's ready to have a heart attack, as you know how it gets. Bird comes in and says, I got a great idea. He said, I'm going to have a team called the Hunchbacks. You heard
it? Yes.
And I said, Jim, that's a great idea. Let's put them against the Rock and Roll Express, and we'll go to the Atlanta Stadium. But the Rock and Roll will go over. He said, how are they going to go over? I said, well, Ricky Morton's going to have a shovel. He's going to dig a hole and put the hump in there and cover him. 1, 2, 3. He said, great idea. I get to go up and go to the bathroom. Cornette follows me. He says, he'll do it. He'll do it. I said, yeah, he will. He had no clue, not a clue. He reminded me of what's the Naked Gun?
Leslie
When the
Nielsen.
guy comes up and said, I don't have a clue, not a clue. Stainless steel artery canal, pulling the handkerchiefs. Oh, the guy's doing nothing.
How come Jim Herd had never heard of submissions? It's like, yeah, fine, they can't be pinned, they've got a hunchback, but just submit them.
He had his own vision, and I think he did shit to piss everybody off, just to piss them off.
With and just before we get off Jim Herd and the stupid thing, George South told me, I think it was George South who told me this recently, was that there was a tag team that came out that was meant to be like the Sicilians or the Gangsters. This is a Jim Herd creation as well, a tag team. And they had like the violin cases, and then they took actual guns or guns that looked very real out and started firing them in the audience. And this actually got it to the ring, not filmed, but they actually did a match and the audience scattered.
Yeah, I remember that. And George was right. George was a great, great guy. I don't know how they allowed her to. Well, I do, because they didn't know anything either. The North Tower knew nothing. And they thought he was a genius. But I think that got him into some trouble. You know what I mean? I think that got him, because Turner is very, very liberal himself, Ted, and the guns things wouldn't sit well with him.
Absolutely. Right, so we had a little break there. It was seamless enough that I didn't have to admit that, but I'm admitting it anyway. But right, so we're going to go, we've done the game, we've done best and worst, and we're going to go to just more of the career. And I've got here NWA, and Kevin was par, because I copy and pasted this question, of Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988, during the time when some of the talent was leaving due to either not being paid or uncertainty surrounding the then potential sale of the company of Turner Broadcasting. When was the first time you heard about Turner buying what would then become WCW? How many months process before he actually bought it?
It came quick, but we all started to see things that weren't going the way they should. Did you ever hear about when they were filming? I forget the name of the show. Was it Worldwide or whatever for Crockett, and they were going to pay the guys a percentage.
I've never heard that.
Well, he filmed. It was almost like you were going to be paid for working on TV. And he owed Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard a lot of money, Jimmy Crockett. And I was saying to myself, they're flying to Greenville, North Carolina, 90 miles away. They said to me, "You can get on the jet if you want. Now I'll drive. I'll be home earlier." They started when we had the bash. We go to the West Coast, but we stay in Vegas. We fly to LA, fly back to Vegas. We go fly to San Francisco, back, San Diego, back, Portland, all the way up. I mean, they were just hemorrhaging money, and nobody said anything to them. And they were lucky. Again, I mentioned how powerful Jim Barnett was. If Jim didn't broker that deal, it might have just dissolved completely. But he knew Turner very well, Barnett. That's how influential he was. And he knew that Ted had a soft spot for wrestling.
Now, Nikita Koloff once told me, I interviewed him about a year ago, and he said, I don't know if this was just before the sale or just after the sale, but there's a company-wide meeting, and questions aren't really being answered, and there's only one person who stands up and sort of takes charge of the meeting who's in the crowd, and it's Jim Cornette. And I think he stands up on a table or stands up on a chair and says, "Hey, we're not getting enough information here. Can you fill us in?" Do you remember that meeting at all?
Yeah. Jimmy, I happen to think the world of Jimmy. And Jimmy is a no bullshit type of guy who's not going to take any bullshit. And they were, at that period is, you could smell the rat, but you didn't know where the smell was coming from. And they were trying their best to hide it. And I thought about this. Some things are hard to believe as time goes on. It's like, here's the accountant. Comes out and tells Jimmy Crockett one day, "You're X million dollars in the hole." What, you don't alert the guy that you're the head accountant? You don't alert him that they're in trouble? Something doesn't equate to me. Does it equate to you? I mean, here's a business that was thriving, selling out, big money. But if the debits and credits don't add up, wouldn't you earlier than when you got into such a quandary say, "Hey, we got a problem here"? That never added up to me. Does that make sense, James?
When you say it that way, and I don't know anything about this, but do you think someone was pocketing quite a substantial amount of money out of the company?
I did, definitely. That's where I was going. Mm-hmm. There was some leaky hole somewhere. It had to be up top. Mm-hmm. It wasn't going to be the accountant's assistant doing it. You know what I mean?
We'll talk about your role after Jim Crockett Promotions come to WCW, but what were the fundamental differences between JCP in October 1988 and WCW in, let's say, December 1988? What changed immediately?
Going to Atlanta was the big change. When did Hurt come?
Great question. Maybe somewhere in 89. I don't know. I'll look it up.
Everybody was kind of tiptoeing around, not sure what was going to happen. Because, this was a pretty monumental thing. The Crockett's have been promoting since the 30s. And lo and behold, the whole empire falls apart. So guys that had worked there for, like Flair and Tully and Hart, worked there, and Jimmy worked there comfortably for years, now are wondering what's going on. So there was the problem of, is this going to last too? You know what I mean? Who's going to take over? And then, as you said, Hurt's going to come in 89. And then that panic sets. That's it.
According to the always reliable Wikipedia, it's January the 3rd, 1989. So it was only a couple of months period, if that. So I know Jim Crockett booked very briefly, just as a fill-in booker. And I don't know if like George Scott did at some point as well around that time.
Yes, George did for a short time. And George intentionally didn't allow the main event on a pay-per-view to be seen. I think it was Steamboat, because he thought it would hurt his towns. I mean, you know, we're talking about you have to evolve. If you want to stay relevant, you have to evolve. I mean, they got a lot of flack. I don't know the whole situation, but I'm sure they had to return a bunch of money. You know what I mean? And it was Steamboat, and it was in New Orleans, and it might have been Steamboat versus Flair. I don't know if it was Flair, but I'm pretty sure it was involving Steamboat. And he had booked that in all the towns around, you know what I mean? So he didn't want to show a finish. Crazy.
I will move on then. And one thing that I think you're quite famous for being part of is the WCW booking committee. Were you part of the initial iteration of the committee, or were you brought in at a later date?
No, I was part of the original when Rick brought me in at the beginning.
So who's the initial team then? So I know it's Rick as the booker. You're brought in. Who else he brings in?
They brought in Eddie Gilbert, me, and Jody Hamilton will be in and out. And Cornette was brought in very quick when Eddie and Rick had a fallen out. So basically, when it was dust settled, it was Rick, Jimmy, myself, Jim Ross, and Jody Hamilton.
Because I don't know the story, why did Eddie and Rick have a falling out?
They had problems for years. It started. Maybe it came to a head. Let's put it that way. When Crockett bought UWF, and Eddie was the booker. I'm sure you heard the story about Eddie had his name on a door. Somebody ripped it off, put Rick's name on there. Eddie was talking about these guys that from UWF not working, going on strike. They were going to go to Memphis, a bunch of them. So Eddie and Rick really never saw eye to eye. I liked Eddie.
With going back to the committee then, was it all peaches and cream at the beginning? You had autonomy to do what you wanted, or was Jim Herd immediately sticking his oar in from the off?
It didn't happen. It happened quick, but it took about a month. And I think somebody was talking to him. Oh, Barnett would drop in quite frequently too. And I think someone was talking to Jim on the side and saying, and trying to manipulate his own position and saying, you better watch these guys. This one's saying this, and they're going to try to do that. And and I could be completely wrong, but I don't think a guy, he had to know he didn't know. You know what I mean? It'd be like you or me commanding a U-2 boat in World War II, I wouldn't, it just didn't seem that he had. And he had this bluster, like he thought he was John Wayne, rah, 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 a little pit bulldog. And I think he did that because he basically really did know that he didn't know shit. He was getting a big payday.
I was going to try and throw the only U-2 boat commander I know in World War II was Carl Dönitz. So yeah, that's my World War II knowledge right there of U-2 boat commanders. Or I think he was commander of the Navy, wasn't he? The German Navy.
I think so.
Admiral, excuse me.
He's the guy that ended up in Spain after the war.
Wasn't he briefly the Chancellor of Germany for like a few days, and then he seceded to the Allies? And then disappeared. I don't even know where he disappeared. He probably got 10 years commuted to nothing in Nuremberg.
No, they said he was found. If it's the same thing I'm thinking of, he ended up going to Casa del Sol in a town called Marara. The reason why I know that, I used to vacation there.
What, you went to see his house, or?
No, he actually, I didn't go to see his. Well, I did see it because everybody pointed out where he lived. Yeah, He lived on top of a mountain overlooking the water. It was beautiful.
Tell you what, it pays, doesn't it? It pays sometimes to be the leader of the opposition and surrendering. You get a nice house out of it. We'll go back to wrestling now. Now, I'm actually going to have to change the script because I have completely messed up the question order. So what I'm going to ask is, off the top of my head, do you remember any storylines, and I'm sure there's quite a few, where you and Cornette, or whoever it is, maybe Jim Ross was there at the time, where it started off great, and then 2 weeks in, Jim Herd gets an idea of, why are you doing this, or why don't you do this instead, and then you have to follow his direction?
Yeah, he used to have this thing where he would say, how did you get there? Did the guy just parachute in? Parachute in? What are you talking about? I mean, you're one of the greatest lines he ever said to me. Your stuff is horrible. He said, because you got to watch it every week to find out what's going on.
Jesus.
I said, what? He said, yeah, you got to follow it every week to find out what's happening. Oh, yeah. I mean, this guy was too much, but the parachuted in. And again, I think there was somebody in the background stirring the pot, creating us against them. You know what I mean?
So Jim Herd was a big fan of Law and Order. So you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end in every episode, and then you can go to the next one.
Yeah, you got it. That's good.
This is something I've written here, and this is more of like a slightly more ethereal question or theoretical question on booking. Is there are like only 7 reasons to have a feud between 2 wrestlers, and I can only think of about 4. There's like fighting over a belt, fighting over a woman, fighting for money, fighting for competition, because one is bad and the other one's good, and you know the righteous shall rule over evil. But I mean, how do you take the 5 that I mentioned and maybe a couple of other reasons people fight and spin it out into years and years and years of content?
I think we have this. Here's what amazes me. Wrestling is so much more covered now that it's been exposed. Everybody still wants to know how it's done. But the longevity is, it's a personal issue. If you get 2 guys that come across that this may be a little legit. It's like AEW, some of these promos now, the guys that are shooting against each other, supposedly. That's all I read about and hear about, right? Mm-hmm. It's like when I did the Angle Pillar, everybody thought it was real. They tuned in. I mean, when I was a kid, I was an amateur wrestler. I knew wrestling was bullshit, but the first time I saw the Sheik, I thought he was real. I thought, oh, everything else is bullshit, but he's real. How is that humanly possible? Everybody else is working except him. So I think it's that you have a connection with somebody and it just works. And it's like Flair and Steamboat. That just worked. It was 2 sides of the same coin. Good, evil, blonde, dark hair. I mean, family man, carouser. It was just perfect. Funk, and then Funk is the same way, but the Wild Man. If you don't have the guy feeling it, I don't care what you do. I don't think it works.
And there's what was I going to say then? Yeah, is it the Johnny Valentine line of, I can't make people believe wrestling is real, but I can make them believe I'm real. How do you make someone
Yeah.
believe that you're real without beating them up?
Well, I think it's energy. It's like I said to you when I was a kid and I saw the Sheik. It was like, I actually thought the building moved. And you know, I don't know if you read that book where Brian Sullivan wrote about, it's called Ice and Fire, the greatest heel of all times.
Mm-hmm.
I was there that night when he talked about, I talked him into using the Sheik in Detroit. I bet them $500. They'll see $500 would draw $100,000 house. It was the biggest house they had at the bash. Only time in my life I was involved in a double switch was me and Murdoch against the Sheik and Dusty in a cage, and it ended up being me and the Sheik against Murdoch and Dusty. But when the Sheik came into the building, he came in when the first match was halfway over, pulled his limo in, got out, draped in gold, 3-piece suit, no shirt, you know. Cornette and Bobby Fulton come around the corner. They're looking at him like they're two little kids, and they're giggling. He has a guy open the trunk, take his bags. He still had that magic, you know. He carried himself as a star. I think it's without beating them up, you have to lay it in. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to cripple someone, but I mean, the people need to hear stuff. You know what I mean? They need to hear like Rick. I think that Rick's gotten away with that chop because he's laid it in for so many years. I don't think people be wooing when the way they do now or a few years ago if he wasn't laying it in.
We're going to go back to booking again, and back to I think it's around 89 this is, and it's quite a well-known story that you, pardon the expression, backdoored Mick Foley into getting a contract with WCW. Was this something, I mean, you'll probably have to explain what I mean by that as well, but is this something you tried with several talents to sort of get under the gaze of Jim Herd, who would probably shave his head and give him an earring and call him Spartacus?
Yeah, there was a lot. We were talking about that last night. I tried for Sabu. His life probably would have been different. I had him a 3-year contract starting at $450. And I told him to sign the contract. He says in this book. And he said he wanted his mother to see the contract. I said, you got to sign it today. And he said, no, I want my mother to see it. So by the time he flew home, it was heading back to cancel the contract. They would be very iffy, and that's why I wanted guys that deserved it, that worked hard, deserved the contract. I mean, there were guys that were handing contracts out because they were friends, nepotism. And I said, you know, Mick deserved, I mean, even back then, he was a hard-working guy. He deserved it. And I tried to do it for a lot of guys, but I didn't do it because they were friends of mine. I might have liked them, but I did it because they were great talent.
Well, I mean, specifically with Mick Foley, and we all know what made him a great talent, I suppose, because, you know, he had the personality and he was real. But even in those days, I mean, he hadn't really been on TV before. Why did you look at him and say, that's a special enough talent that I'm going to go out of my way to do this for him?
Because he was different. He was different. Everybody else had hot stuff on, matching tights and boots. Here's Mick, looked like he had come out of a dumpster, you know, and he's got a tie on, runs down. The first time we had him on TV, I asked Cornette, what can he do? He says, throws a great elbow off the apron. The guy was his partner got beat. They threw him out. He was about 12 feet away, and Mick jumped off and dropped an elbow on him. I said, this guy deserves a contract. He's a hard-working guy. Yeah. And look what happened. Mick broke records.
Did you also create the scene, I think it was on a Clash of the Champions with Cactus versus Mil Mascaras?
What scene was that? Because the mill was, boy, you talk about, we talked about keeping it real. Mill has thought it's real since the beginning of the time, I think. He gave Cactus a tough day for that.
Yeah. What is it with Mill that he just won't? Because I think on maybe his Hall of Fame, something like that, he was saying, I would only sell if they'd hit me hard, that kind of thing. But it's like, why? Sounded like a cop-out line, really.
Yeah, I think it was a cop-out line. I mean, do you know the history of Mil Mascaras?
No, I don't.
Okay. Salvador Luderoff, I believe, was the promoter at the time. They came up with this idea, Mil Mascaras is coming, and they put it up at billboards. And they promoted it. And they had no idea who it was going to be. And they found him at a gym. He was, I believe, wasn't he Mr. Mexico or whatever? But they put a mask on him and he went right to the top and stayed there for 55 or 60 years, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody put him over, from the Destroyer of Japan. I don't think he ever did a job in Japan. I mean, not even a count out, I don't think. If somebody got counted out, it was a double count. I mean, he was very difficult, and that made Mick's job very hard. But I thought it was going to be good for Mick to get that exposure. I thought it would be in the magazines. It would go to Japan and maybe give Mick some different kind of credibility.
It sounds to me, just how you're describing it there, that they just booked Mil Mascaras like Goldberg.
Yeah, but it was international. Like they did it. They did it everywhere. I mean, he was the first masked wrestler in New York City.
Mm-hmm. Whoops. I think we're getting a call. One sec.
Yeah. Mil Mascaras was the first guy to wear a mask in New York. Up until then, guys would wear masks, but the mask was out. They just have the hood on their head. It looked like a condom. So he had that kind of power, sway over everywhere he went. He was catered to.
Did you ever see his face?
Never.
Did he shower with the mask on? I've heard that before.
Yeah, when I saw him, he showered with the mask on. Yeah.
Deary me. Him and the Maguire twins, I tell you, some of the oddest sights in the shower you'll ever see, I'm sure. We'll move on. Right, so this is another, I don't know if it's more of a game, but it's just something I'm going to throw out there. Of all the terrible WCW characters that happened in the early 90s, I've got a list of them. The Juicer, Arachnaman, Brad Armstrong, Ding Dongs, Black Scorpion, Shockmaster, Big Josh, Candyman, Brad Armstrong, Dynamic Dudes, etc. Were any of those salvageable in any way?
Yeah, we could have made the Dynamic Dudes heels, but they would be portraying baby faces. Like when they went to Philly, they got raked over the coals. I mean, raked over the coals. So you could have had them as a novelty act because they were young guys. They could have developed into real, very good heels. But if they started that where, hey, it's great to be here, and everybody's booing them out of the building, it would have been unique, and they could have developed. And then you could have done something with them where they used the goofy skateboard to hit somebody on the head. Oh, it was an accident. Didn't mean it. I thought he was going to steal my skateboard. And then developed them as heels because they had so much heat. I felt sorry for them. You know what I mean?
And what did the fans chant that night in Philly?
Johnny does something to Shane.
Do you know, I think the Dynamic Dudes thing is always interesting in the sense that it's like Pavlov's gun. If you ain't going to use it by the third act as far as the skateboards, what have you got them for in the first place?
Right. And that was Jim Hurd's big deal. Somehow he had seen, what was it, Tony Hawk? Was that his name?
Yeah.
Yeah. He had seen him documentary or something. They came in, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thought he had recreated the wheel. Those poor guys. young, good-looking guys coming down to Philly against the rock and roll. Midnight Express. Oh, that was horrible.
Well, I mean, they both get over it eventually, I think. I've not actually asked this, but I'm very interested to know that were you always, until the end, pretty much with WCW, and then you would go to other indies and territories at the same time, or did you leave WCW a clean break at some point?
Well, I had been the booker, then Russo came in, then I came back, and I had just signed a 3-year contract. And then Brad Siegel sent me home after I had 2 weeks on my brand new contract. So I went home for 3 years, opened up the biggest gym in the Florida Keys, built it from the ground up. It was great. But I mean, at the time, the Florida Keys didn't have chain stores, so it was only 8,000 square feet, but no chain could come in on top of me. Mm. So it was a great period of my life. Yeah.
How did you end up in Smoky Mountain? Because I mean,
Jimmy and I were friends, and I was working in Japan at the time, and Jimmy would ask me to come in, and because Jimmy and I are good friends, and I had friends in Knoxville because I'd wrestled in Knoxville quite a bit, so it was great to go over.
Yeah. I suppose give us a brief summing up of your time in Smoky Mountain, because I hadn't realised how long you were there for. You had loads of matches, and it was mostly against Brian Lee and the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker was Brian Adams, wasn't he? Adam Bomb.
Yeah, Adam Bomb. I mean, I just saw him, and I didn't realize until how time kind of clouds your memory, I guess. Brian was a huge, I knew he was big, but I saw he had a tape running behind him. He was a huge, huge guy. And Jimmy I'll tell you something about Smoky Mountain Wrestling. What killed Jimmy was he had Knoxville. If he had gotten Chattanooga 100 miles away, if he had gotten Cincinnati 200 miles away, and if they had given him, he maneuvered with somebody, or if he just went in and took like Roanoke or Winston-Salem, if he had 4 big cities, he might have survived. But you can't keep going to little towns when you don't have a cash flow coming in from the big towns.
You were there during, I suppose, like the peak years when Smoky Mountain was actually making at least a bit of money, and they had they were in the black rather than the red, yeah. And I've heard before that at this time in some towns they were outdrawing WCW.
Oh yeah, Jimmy. I mean, I think as time goes by, that people don't understand how smart Jimmy Cornette was. You had to work with him. You told me he's a very smart guy. He gets fixated on something, he stays fixated on it. And like I said, if he was doing really well in Knoxville, but if you don't reach out to having, we'll say, 2 big towns a week, like if he had Knoxville on Friday and Chattanooga on Saturday, or if he had Cincinnati on a Saturday or a Sunday, where you can afford to bring in a little higher quality of talent to keep him there. Because he was reaching out to Paul Orndorff was there, Ronnie Garvin came in. He was reaching out to guys that were his friends that would love to work for Jimmy, but they weren't going to stay there full time. He needed 1 or 2 anchors, and then he could have built off of it.
And I mean, obviously the wrestling business was in a depression, and obviously Hulk Hogan was going to be having too high of a price tag at the time. But I mean, who out there, 92, 93, was out there who you think could have been that anchor?
It's hard to say because you hit it on the head. We were in a depression, the country. Gas was starting to go up. You had to go, I don't think at that period there wasn't a freelance guy out there that could have, unless you stole somebody away. When I say stole somebody away, unless you offered a bunch of money to somebody that was drawing money and making money, I don't think you could bring anybody in. It was just one of those lapses of the wrestling business, which has its ups and downs, ebbs and flows.
I've got a couple more things about Smoky Mountain. I'll move on. And one of them, someone wrote to me and said you once cut an interview talking about clubbing baby seals in Norway.
Yeah, I did. Of course, I didn't do it, but that's what they used to do. They used to club baby seals. I think I used it as that's as fun as clubbing baby seals. I mean, how does that become a tradition for years and years and years? I mean, clubbing babies, little white baby seals, sounds crazy.
Oh no, we've got another call. One sec. And with Smoky Mountain, I can never not ask the requisite Jim Cornette question of, do you remember the time or the first time or the most memorable time he had a complete emotional meltdown over the most minor of incidents?
They all blurred together. I mean, it was like that was Jimmy's daily explosion. I do remember one time in a small town in Kentucky where New Jack got on the microphone and said some crazy shit. And Jimmy just about lost it completely when he went like, the old Jackie Gleason bullshit. Ooh, I thought he was going to pass out. But New Jack kept on running his mouth, and Jimmy was, somebody pull the plug, get out there. Yeah.
Was this the one with Jim Ross?
He does have what?
Was this the one with Jim Ross who was doing the interview? It was like on a major event for them.
I don't think this one was. No, I know it wasn't. He went out there and just grabbed the mic and ran these people down, and we were in White Bread, Kentucky, and boy, he almost caused a major riot.
I've got a couple more questions, then we'll go to our main event, as it were. And one thing that several people also asked me to ask you, and I do not know the story whatsoever, so I'll be hearing it for the first time. Kanemaru Spike story. That's all I have.
I had gone to wrestle for Wings, the offshoot of FMW, and Kenny Mora was the huge babyface they were pushing. So I talked Jimmy into bringing Kenny Mora in. The company Wings sent him over, and he started making a tour of the U.S., which they used to do. Went to Puerto Rico, I think he ended up going to ECW too. But he comes to me, Kenny Moore, on TV, and says, Sullivan's on. Use Spike on my arm. I said, Spike your arm. Why not head? No. Arm. Everybody bleed head. I said, okay. I'm not going to say no. Match starts. I jump him, stay on him. Starts making come back. I think he threw me in the ropes. I might have kicked him. He went down. Pulled the spike up, and I stabbed him on the arm. He has a surgical knife. He cut his shoulder from below his shoulder almost down to his elbow. It opened up so clean, it was hardly bleeding. It was about that much open. So people were starting to scream. The camera eventually threw a big X on it. And I said, well, the bad news is the bad news right now. So I took the spike and stuck it in there. And I could see the tendons and bones. And Arn Anderson happened to be the guest commentator and said, that's the worst thing I've ever seen. what could I do? I mean, so now, I mean, he's sliced open. He had to get numerous stitches in and out. We get back to the dressing room, and I do feel horrible about it. I think, why would anybody do that? He comes up, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very big in Japan now. Very big in Japan. So the funny thing was, about a month ago, one of the Japanese boys I know said, Kenny Moore said, thank you very much. And I started laughing. I mean, it was the worst cut I ever saw in my life.
Is this, I've never heard that before. Is this like the Sabu thing of scars mean badge of courage kind of thing?
Surgical blade. I'll tell you what else he did. When I went to Japan after this incident, he come up to me and says, I knew what the angle was. It was the wrestle of the year. It was between me and him. And he said, Sullivan's on trophy. It wasn't a trophy, it was a plaque. But he said trophy. Trophy in glass case. They give to me, you punch me, you take it, and then throw it in my face. I said, what? He said, yeah, you punch me, pull it, and throw it in my face. So now I'm thinking, well, it's got to be sugar glass, you know what I mean? And I said, sugar glass? No, glass. Okay. I said, if anybody said to me, Kevin Sullivan's going to throw a glass case in my face, I'd say no. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. He said, you have to. So Victor Keone, who was the booker, came and said, oh, he can take it in the way it will break. He said, I've done it, tested it 1,000 times. Well, you know, that's bullshit. 1,000 times. And I said, he said, when it breaks, it will shatter and just fall to the ground. So when I threw it, I tried to throw the bottom was wood like that. So the wood hit him. But as it tumbled over, it hit him in the face and shattered. Thank God he didn't get cut. But I mean, that FMW and that wings, you know, that's where Sabu got those scars. They really transcended some really violent shit.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, was that the worst instance of a cut, or was the wedge more extreme? But I think you've already answered it.
The wedge, you mean the arm?
Now, this is a story you told, and this is in the back of my head.
Oh, no, the chisel.
Yeah.
The chisel. The arm was horrible, you know, because it was so long. But the chisel, my head was numb for 6 months. Yeah. That's how we like it up here, boy. Lay him in.
Was this Ron and Don?
Chain down. Was this left the ring?
Was this Ron and Don Wright?
Ron and Don Wright.
There we go.
Give you East Tennessee dog whipping. Boy, they were crazy.
It's funny because I just had that in my mind, and also it sort of leads us magnificently into the ending of this show that will take it to until we end, and I call it the firing line. I'm just going to give you some names. You tell me what you think about them. And of course, the very first people I mention are Ron and Don Wright.
Heat magnets. Heat magnets drew nothing but money, and they were legit badasses.
With Ron, is it Ron that was in Smoky Mountain?
Yeah, Ron was in Smoky Mountain.
Yeah, I've never seen the footage where he's been in the wheelchair for so long and then miraculously he gets out of it. But I mean, were you there for the reaction of that?
No, I wasn't. I was going back and forth at the time. But he was such a heel up there because he was one of them, and you know, he talked down to them. They actually burnt his plane one night. He was a pilot. He was crazy.
There's another story I've heard, and I think it's probably Ron Wright again. So back in the 70s, I think they must have got the NWA World Champion in, and maybe it was Harley Race or Dory Funk or whoever. And it was the only territory where the audience could not believe that anybody could beat Ron Wright, even the NWA World Champion.
You're absolutely right. They started booing at the 30-minute mark and booed all the way through.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's keeping yourself strong, and then there's Superman.
He was Superman too. He was Superman.
I will move on then. Jimmy Valiant.
One of the nicest human beings on God's earth.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Next one, I'll ask. God, I've got so many. Blackjack Mulligan.
One of the most imposing athletes I've ever seen. He was very, very kind to me. He's the one that got me over before Dusty. He was very nice to me, and he let me stiff Barry when he was a young boy all the time.
How did he specifically get you over?
When I wrestled Barry on TV for the Florida title, and we went 56 minutes because the title was vacant. And I went to leg dive Barry at like the 50-minute mark, and Barry stepped out of the way, and I fell out of the ring, and Barry held the ropes up, and I got in. Then for the finish, Barry went to do it for me. I stepped out of the way. He ended up, I held the ropes up when he walked in. I kicked him in the face and beat him. Well, the following Sunday, it was when I was there, my program was I was a baby face, but I hated them. The Mulligans hated me. The Wyndhams hated me. And I got to Orlando for the first time. I was going to be a heel in Florida, and Blackjack, which we didn't go back and forth to dress rooms back then. And this was in Orlando, they couldn't see. Blackjack said to Dusty, "What do you want to do this match?" It was me against Blackjack. He said, "Let's work a DQ." Blackjack said, "No, what he's going to do is he's going to beat me, leave me laying. Barry's coming down, he's going to leave Barry laying. Kendall's coming down, he's going to leave Kendall coming down." He said, "That big boy, you come down for the save, he's going to leave you laying." So, and then they showed that on TV. I left the whole, which they called the family, I left them all dead, you know. So he was very nice to me.
Yeah. Next name is Haystacks Calhoun, which you've actually wrestled. I had no idea until I read up on this today.
I was his tag team partner. In Florida, I was the Florida tag team partners with Haystacks. And I was also a tag team partner with him in New York. He was at one time a huge attraction way before we got together. I saw him on the tail end. Injuries got to him, illness got to him. But he had been one of the biggest attractions in the mid and late 50s in the wrestling business, in the early 60s. Yeah.
Was he still a draw by the time you were? Was this the early 70s you were tagging with?
He was a little bit of a draw, but he had been around so much, and he'd done a stick, which was very limited, you know. But he was better than most to have a look at.
Now, this is someone I don't think I've ever asked of before. Dennis Stamp.
Oh, wild man. Dennis Stamp was a wild man. I mean, he had a different point of view. And I mean, what was that documentary, Beyond the Mat? With Dennis was in it. That was Dennis Stamp. What you see is what you get.
Trampoline bouncing, and he wasn't booked.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
You mentioned this fella before, but I wanted to get a bit more information on him. Victor Quinones.
Very smart guy. Very smart guy. Well-to-do. Had a few hotels he owned with different partners. He got along in the Puerto Rican territory running opposition, which is unheard of. I kind of think they might have been an offshoot to keep other opposition out of there. He went to FMW, then he split off of Wings. He passed way too soon.
Next one is Mongolian Stomper.
One of the all-time greats and one of the greatest guys in shape forever. When he ran the Dallas Marathon at 260 pounds.
I remember seeing footage of him in Smoky Mountain when he was like probably Knights of the Legends or something, and he was in his mid-50s, and he still looked like in amazing shape.
Oh, he was. He was amazing shape until he passed. He was obsessive compulsive disorder, CAD carrying member, because when he did something, it was obsessed.
Mm. Well, there's worse things to be obsessed with than doing sit-ups, definitely. Bruiser Brody, who we also mentioned before.
I've wrestled Brody about I don't know, numerous times, but 90% of the time I was the heel. I was booking in Florida. I bring Frank in, and he was booking in San Antonio. He'd bring me in, and I had a great relationship with Frank. And when I was booking in Knoxville, Mulligan would let me bring him in. In fact, Mulligan told me, call Frank and bring him in.
What is it that, obviously he always had a contentious relationship with pretty much every promoter he ever worked for, but what was he always after? Was he always after remaining strong? Was he always after just getting a better payday than everyone else? Why was he always so difficult for promoters?
I think it was, well, with Mulligan, there was never a cross word. He would always say, when do you want me back? And he wasn't getting giant payoffs, but I know that Jack was given a certain guarantee. He just, for some reason, did not trust the promoters, which is probably rightfully so, but he almost saw that if he didn't say strong, it might have been a little bit of paranoia. If I don't say strong, they're going to weaken me to a point where I'm not going to drop. I don't know. It was very, very strange.
I once heard a story where I think maybe it was in Houston, and some sort of disagreement, let's say with Paul Bosch, and who, if it would have been in Houston, and instead of going to the ring and having a match, he went to the ring and sat down and crossed his legs for about 15 minutes.
It was him and Mark Lewin in San Antonio.
Oh, really? So it was an old trick.
They both went in separate corners and sat on their asses. I'll never know why that happened, but it did. When I brought it to Mark, he just blew it off.
Did Bruiser ever do the Ernie Ladd trick of making sure that everybody knew he was in town, driving around the arena saying hello to everyone, and then no-show the event?
I never know. I don't know if he did or not. But Frank wasn't that kind of guy. Frank would just show up, he would make them panic. Where's he coming? Where's he coming? Not that, hey, Frank ain't coming. We saw him driving around. He took off. No, yeah. He do it the other way.
But similarly, as I hear from everyone who talks about Frank, Bruiser Brody, a great guy.
Oh, super guy. I know his wife, Barbara, now. I met her for the first time a couple of years ago. Wonderful lady. Wonderful lady.
We'll move on, and we'll say Rick Steiner.
I'll tell you a funny story about Rick Steiner. I knew he had to be a baby face when he was with the Varsity Club. The people were turning him. And I went to Dusty and I said, Dusty, we got to turn him baby face. Can't keep him heel. So we turned, and he turned on me, or I turned on him. So we go to Boston for the first time. And the Detroit Pistons, are you aware of NBA basketball?
Yep.
Detroit Pistons have won the NBA title. So I get with the ring announcer and tell him what to say. So I said, Rick, you're going out first tonight. He said, why? I said, because I want you to start hooting and hollering. And Marvin Hagler, the fighter, the welterweight champion, was in the front row. And I said, get the people going. I said, this is going to be easy. So Rick starts to come out and he's doing that. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And the whole building's doing that. And the ring announcer says, and coming down the aisle, the dog-faced gremlin from the home of the new NBA world champions, the Detroit Pistons. Gilden turned on him like that. He gets in the building spoon. I come down the aisle and the announcer says, and Boston's own Kevin Sullivan from the home of the greatest franchise in the history of the NBA, the Boston Celtics. I'm a babyface. First spot, he takes me, shoots me in the ropes, and he gives me a clothesline. I do Linda Blair. You know, The Exorcist, my head goes around and I get knocked out of the ring. I pull myself up, and who am I looking at? Marvel and Hagler. I said, hey, brother, I need some help. He looked at me and said, not tonight, brother. Great guy.
Who was the crazier of the two, Rick or Scott? Because I think people in the know always said that actually Rick is the really crazy guy.
Yeah, Rick is the real nut. Rick is the real nut. Scott's just a little bit more flamboyant and boisterous. But Rick is certified insane.
Were you? I don't know if you were around the booking office at this time, but just while you were talking about Rick Steiner, I remember a story out the back of my head where probably Jim Herd wanted Ric Flair, or maybe it was Dusty Rhodes wanted Ric Flair to lose to Rick Steiner in 5 minutes. Is that true? And can you sort of confirm my half memory?
I don't remember it being Rick Steiner, but I do remember Herd wanted Flair to lose to Scott.
Ah.
And I think that's where all the heat over those years came from.
I'll give you a few more then. Skandor Akbar.
He was a grizzled veteran when I first got in the first NWA territory. Strong guy. Did the craziest bench press I've ever saw, James. He would load up 315, 365 on the floor, pull it up, lay on the bench, pull it up to his chest, bench press, wooden racket, drop it down to his chest, sit up, and put it on the floor. And a very smart wrestling mind, yeah.
Who else am I going to ask? Bullet Bob Armstrong.
Oh, one of the greatest babyface comebacks in his generation. Great. Drew money everywhere he went.
Yeah. Where was his strongholds? Was it Alabama way? Where was the biggest draw? Or
he was a huge draw in Georgia. He was a big draw in Florida too. Big draw in Pensacola. That's where they moved to. And actually, the town's called Gulf Breeze. It's just outside Pensacola. And Alabama, yeah, he was big in the rural South.
Yeah. How big were his arms legitimately? Did you ever find out?
I would say they were 21, right at 21, shade under.
I'll give you maybe three more. I mentioned him. We mentioned him. In fact, you know what? Let's bring up Ernie Ladd again.
I don't know why, but Ernie Ladd really liked me when I was a kid. And he was going to wrestle Bruno in the next. My job when I was there was to get the guy ready for Bruno. And he was going to wrestle Bruno in Madison Square Garden. And like on a Monday, the previous Saturday, we were at Nassau Coliseum. He was wrestling me. It was supposed to be a squash match. And Ernie gave me 90% of the match, put the gimmick on his thumb, gave me the Asiatic spike, covered me, and put his feet on the ropes, and we had a riot. And the local promoters were going crazy because he was going to wrestle Bruno. And he said, you guys don't even understand the business. If you sat underneath my learning tree, you'd understand that seat. And he was right. He was a great guy. And when I was a kid, I saw him play for the San Diego Chargers. And he was the first professional football player not to keep his helmet on at all times. He wanted that face to be seen all over the TV. Great guy.
Did he wrestle and play NFL at the same time? Well, I think like Wahoo did that, didn't he, as well?
Yeah, Wahoo did it too. Yeah.
Do you know what? Actually, just because this is something that was told to me when you were in the WWF, did you ever get the sense that all of the local guys, and I'll sort of lump you in there as well. I know you're not from New York, but a few hundred miles away northeast, all of the local guys would always be put on the bottom of the card, and they would just never ascend upwards, whereas all the people further afield would do.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it goes back to remember about people stealing territories.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has something to do with that too. Yeah.
I'll give you two more, and then I will thank you so much for your time, and we'll say Dr. Death.
What a physical specimen. Wow. And he could run and strong. Oh, he was a great guy. Great guy. But strong. I saw him pick up Terry Gordy, and they did this spot where he picked up Terry and like launched him for, like that, like you would have slammed, but Terry landed on a splash on the top of the guy when they were partners. And he picked up Terry with one arm, just crossed him, whoop. And Terry had to be 275. Yeah, he was an incredibly strong guy.
And the very last one, I think it'd be nice to end on a fun story about Mike Graham.
Mike and I were very close. We had a love-hate relationship. We were very competitive with one another. But the whole angle when I went to Florida was the Wyndhams in Rotunda and those baby faces were saying I was not the same guy that left Florida, that I was no good. And Mike and other baby faces were saying, you guys shouldn't be talking. Your father was one of the most hated guys in wrestling. So Mike is my cheerleader. And when I told you about Barry, when I kicked him in the face and won the belt, Mike was the ring. He was commentating with Gordon. He goes, what are you doing that? Why did you do that? And I had the belt and I laid it in on him. I mean, I laced him in the face. And I knew we'd get a reaction out of him. I knocked him off the stool because they used to have stools. I knocked him off the stool. His feet went right up in the air. He started running around the desk. But do you remember when they had buttons in the fly Levi's?
It's buttons instead of
rather than a zipper.
Yeah.
He had blown all the buttons. He was trying to chase me, and his pants are falling down, and he's pulling it up. Oh, he was a great guy, on a lot of burden his whole life trying to live up to his father. Very difficult.
Would it? I've heard this said about maybe David Sammartino, a couple of other guys like that. Would it have behooved Mike Graham to go to another territory under an assumed name? Do you think that would have benefited him more?
Absolutely. And there was I don't want to say curse, but there was some kind of gene that wasn't right in that family. Eddie's father committed suicide with a gun. Eddie did. Mike's son did. Mike did. And then Eddie's brother did. That is not normal.
No, it's a terrible, a terrible legacy to leave in that sense. And it's also quite similar to the Von Erichs as well in that sense.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to end the podcast on such a down note, but maybe I should have saved that like a happier story for last. But listen, we've spent 2 hours together. I want to thank you so much for all your time. I don't know if you've got any plugs you want to throw out at me that I can include in all the clips and everything, but if you have, this is the time to say them.
Yeah, a friend of mine wrote a book. It's called Old School Ring Squared, and it's a historical novel. And it starts in 1948. And it's The Sopranos meets wrestling. And it's a true behind the scenes of why wrestling was suppressed for all those years. It's very interesting.
Right. So this is a historical book.
Historical fiction because the names have changed, but you can figure out who the names are.
Right.
You can get it on Amazon.com.
Okay, then I will hunt for that. I'll put the links on and I'll get all that out. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. I believe we've got some more interview time booked up. But for now, you said some very nice things about me and you watched some things, and I'll say some nice things back at you. I was a fan of yours as a wrestler, but I'm more of a fan of your mind and your personality as well. So thank you so much for spending so much time with me.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. We'll catch you again next week, or whenever next week happens. When this is recorded, I don't know. I don't know the schedules. But there you go. We'll see. Someone will be here next week. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Kev.
Thank you, babe.